Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Toope, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, and it's my great honor to welcome you to this Cambridge Conversation, our popular series bringing you Cambridge ideas and research. I'll be the host and moderator for today's digital event. After our conversation, there'll be around 20 minutes where our speakers will respond to audience questions, and you can submit a question at any point by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of the page and typing in your question. This event is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel. The world's population currently sits at nearly 8 billion people. Just 100 years ago, less than 2 billion people lived on this planet. The population has quadrupled and every person needs to be fed. The population has quadrupled, but our Earth remains the same size. So we plant more crops and raise more cattle and build more food processing factories. Agriculture is among the greatest contributors to climate change, emitting more greenhouse gases than all our cars, trucks, trains, and airplanes combined. Farming uses our precious water supplies and is a major polluter of river systems through runoff from fertilizers and manure. And as we clear forest and grassland, we remove not only diverse plants and trees, but the animals, from insects to lizards to mammals to birds, which inhabit those environments. We aren't simply farming land to sustain ourselves either. As prosperity increases, we want food from all around the world. My local supermarket here in Cambridge stocks avocados all year round. I can buy grapes any day of the year. There's a complete stock of different meat available every day. And that, of course, isn't only here in Cambridge. All over the world, our rising middle class demands more rich and varied diets. Yet, at the same time, according to the United Nations, across the globe, 690 million people regularly go to bed on an empty stomach. And in 2021, it's likely to be more because it's estimated that up to an extra 132 million people have been left hungry because of the effects of the COVID pandemic. We need more food to feed our world. And that means growing more and more crops, clearing more and more land, creating more and more greenhouse emissions. It's a vicious circle that has the potential to see us doubling the amount of crops grown by 2050. What's the solution? How can we grow the crops needed to feed the Earth's burgeoning population and at the same time limit global warming, which will in turn make it harder to grow crop and raise livestock? Is it through genetic modification of crops? The use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides? Can we improve the fertility of the soil and the production of the world's staples naturally? Is it possible to save our remaining biodiversity, even to integrate environments so that food production doesn't hinder life on Earth? We must become more efficient, and that's something our Cambridge scientists are working towards every day because our world depends on it. With me today are Giles Oldroyd, Director of the Crop Science Center at the Department of Plant Sciences in alliance with the National Institute of Agricultural Botany. Professor David Coomes is Director of our Conservation Research Initiative and Director of the Center for Earth Observation, and he's based in the Department of Plant Sciences. Dr. Carol Ebay completed her PhD as part of the Gates Cambridge Scholarship Program. Currently a postdoctoral scientist in the Saunders Laboratory at the John Innes Centre, Norwich. She also established the JR Biotek Foundation, which provides training and support for Africa-based researchers and students. Well, welcome to each one of you. It's great to have you with us today. Look, I think we all have this somewhat idyllic idea that farms, certainly here in the UK, are really pretty places with some cows, sheep, hedgerows, crops. But as the world approaches 8 billion people, that isn't the real picture, is it? Giles, could you paint a picture of agriculture in the 21st century for us?
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. Yeah, the image that is always advertised at us of agriculture, I think, is this rather pastoral idyll of a family farm from the 1950s. But in fact, since that time, we've had a massive transformation in our agricultural system that has involved a huge amount of intensification. So we've seen a big increase in mechanization that's required much larger fields, so fewer hedgerows because of the size of the machinery. We've seen a lot more specialization in agriculture in the UK. So rather than mixed livestock and arable, farmers have tended to be either livestock and having much larger herds, or focused only on crop production and having a few crops that they rotate. And then we've also seen over the last 70 years a much greater dependence on the use of chemical inputs into agriculture. So that's inorganic fertilizers to provide nutrients to crop plants, and then pesticides and herbicides and fungicides to control insect pests, diseases, and weeds that grow in our field. So all of that has meant we grow a lot more food, as you've already highlighted. And in fact, you know, here in the UK, we've seen our food production triple or quadruple over the last 70 years. And that's amazing, and really has meant that farming has kept up pace with the demands that come upon us from a growing population. But it does mean that the agricultural landscape now supports far less biodiversity than it did 70 years ago, and creates an awful lot more pollution because of the chemical inputs.
That's interesting. Carol, you're from Nigeria. Tell us a little bit about farming in your part of Africa. Is it as industrialized in a sense as Giles has just described here in the UK?
Right. So in Nigeria, just like most of Africa, there are different types of farming, right? There is livestock farming, crop farming. There are people who, like in Kenya, the flower industry is a big market there as well. However, farming can be industrialized, but the majority of farmers in African countries still rely on subsistence farming. And just to paint a picture of what agriculture looks like in Africa as a continent, and this mirrors across different nations, is that the majority, in fact, agriculture is the largest employer of labor in Africa. It employs an average of 54% of the population, even up to 65%. And now 90% of the people who produce the food that we eat or consume in Africa, which are mainly smallholder farmers, themselves live in extreme poverty. And so subsistence farming is a way of living and livelihood for the majority of people. But what we've seen is that for the industrialized farming is there. However, it is largely sponsored by politicians or governments or rich business people who are now buying up farms and lands and making it more industrial in order to use, they use fertilizers and use all kinds of landscapes to improve food production, not necessarily to feed the population to address hunger and starvation issues, but rather from a business point of view. We also have international influences and funders, for instance, that are funding industrial farming across Africa. And there's a recent report from Kenya, where Kenya researchers actually did some research into agricultural research and development in Kenya and found that 85% of Bill and Melinda Gates funded projects are actually industrial farming, which are bad for the environment, but also do not necessarily address the problem of hunger and starvation. So we're still here. Majority of people relying on subsistence farming with no tools, don't have access to markets, don't have the right infrastructure, don't have the right education. And so we keep going around in circles, and that's where we are at this point.
So, I mean, you've talked about an emerging sort of industrialization of agriculture implanted in more traditional subsistence farming, and Giles has talked about monoculture. There is a theme here, the need to perhaps recapture biodiversity in our farms. David, how do we go about trying to recapture biodiversity?
Well, I mean, in the UK, I think it's a very exciting time in that the government, with its 25-year environment plan, really is looking forward to investing public money in public good, as it calls it. And I think that will involve more protection and enhancement of nature in our agricultural lands for the services they provide to society. So one of the important services is carbon storage in our woodlands, but also in our peatlands. And that carbon is staying in vegetation, not going up into the atmosphere, And that makes it actually incredibly valuable. It's got a new value, which was hitherto unrecognized in our financial systems, but is creeping in as recognized as important financially. And so I think there are opportunities in the coming years for greater protection and expansion of nature across our British landscape. And even small things like extending a network of woodlands and biodiverse grasslands, even on a small scale, would be extremely valuable. We've actually got 41,000 tiny fragments of ancient woodland left across the UK. They were there because of medieval land practices. Everybody needed to chop down a tree to build their house in those days, so they kept these little bits of woodland. But they're small, we've got a chance to expand them. So in the UK, I think there's lots of opportunity. Where the real pressure on biodiversity is, of course, is in the tropics, where we've got this really massive expansion of agriculture, some for commodities for the West, but also feeding a growing population. And I think we do need to work out new mechanisms to make those systems of swidden agriculture, where people move the agricultural land every few years. We've just got to intensify that so that they aren't occupying so much land that they're getting the same amount of yield out of small lands. And we've got to work out mechanisms of protecting forests by payment in the tropical systems and savannas, so that there's a sort of counterbalance to this huge commodity market, which is ruining much of the tropical biodiversity.
So David, you've painted a mixed picture of some opportunity, but also some real challenges. Giles, how would you go about addressing this question of biodiversity in agriculture?
Yeah, I'm rather excited by a sort of emerging vision, which is really setting land aside for biodiversity, but having that on a sort of landscape scale that really preserves that biodiversity. It's not tiny fragments where the tiniest bit of some bad year and you've lost that species of butterfly in that tiny fragment. So I find the rewilding movement very exciting, because I think it's a mechanism that facilitates that creation of sort of a landscape scale preservation of biodiversity. So you're setting areas aside, you say, this is really about biodiversity, and that's principally what we're focusing on. And then the counter of that is you have to say there's other areas where we're really focusing on productivity. Because clearly, as you already outlined, Stephen, we've got a big challenge, and that hasn't gone away. It's actually going to get worse. So, going to go from 8 to 10 billion people. And we're going to see increased wealth. So demand for agricultural products is going to increase over the next 30 years. And we're going to have to meet that increased demand. So we do have to say there's areas that we do productivity. But from what I would like to see is that those areas where we're focusing on productivity, that we drive up sustainability of that system, so that you don't have areas where they're producing food, but then polluting the environments where you're trying to support biodiversity. So we need to make those productive areas self-contained and maintain productivity, but reduce all those chemical inputs, so you're reducing the impact on the rest of the environment.
One of the ways, of course, of potentially increasing productivity, and it relates to your own research, I think, is genetic modification of crops to improve their resilience, to improve their yields, etc. But I don't have to tell you that some consumers, and indeed some farmers, are really quite nervous about genetic modification in crops. How do you go about convincing people that that productivity gain is worth what are perceived to be risks, I suppose?
I think for me, the argument is changing or the discussion is changing, because in fact, it's not, I don't think it's a part about productivity, but I think principally what I care about is sustainable productivity and equitable productivity. So making sure the smallholder farmers, as Carol has alluded to, are able to produce what they need and even produce in excess, so they can sell it on the market. And then that in middle and high income countries, that we're actually driving up the sustainability of the system. And I think really what we need is a transformation in the way we do agriculture, because I don't think it's producing food right now, but it's at too high a price to the environment. And then in places like sub-Saharan Africa, it's just not even producing enough. So we need to raise that productivity and reduce the impact on the environment. So generally, the reason that people are fearful of GM, in part, I think, is because it's a difficult technology to understand, and it's easy to be fearful of something you don't understand. But then also, people have seen that companies have used GM to gain a large market share of the global seed supply. And I think that's a legitimate concern. And I think that's something that we should be discussing. You know, who controls the seed that we grow and we consume? But if we're going to see this transformation, if we're really going to achieve this sort of vision of come 2050, where we've preserved biodiversity, we've met the needs of the global population, and we've achieved sustainability in our crop productivity, that's a huge ask. And we're just not going to get that sort of scale of agricultural transformation with plant breeding alone. Plant breeding has been brilliant. It's really driven up crop productivity over the 20th century. But in the 21st century, the outputs of plant breeding have plateaued. And that's because we've mined a lot of the existing diversity in our crop plants. It's not to say there's no place for plant breeding going forwards, but we're not going to get an agricultural transformation. We're not going to be able to get rid of all the chemical inputs through plant breeding alone. Absolutely not. You're going to have to accept other technologies, including genetic modification, gene editing. These are exciting technologies for us researchers. And I think we can use those technologies to change the way we do farming for the better.
So sustainable productivity is a theme here that we'll obviously be pursuing for a while. Carol, you've set up a foundation, as I mentioned, JR Biotek, to help build crop science capacity across Africa, and also to ensure that farmers across the continent are able to maximize productivity. So tell us a little bit about the foundation and what it's seeking to achieve.
Right, so I set up the JR Biotek Foundation from my own personal experience. Growing up in Nigeria, doing my undergraduate degree there in core science, and having to go to the US to do an advanced degree, and found out that my undergraduate degree did not necessarily prepare me for the next steps in my career pursuit. So while other people were 1,000 steps ahead of me, I was kind of behind trying to catch up. And that foundation not being quite strong isn't what we need at this time with the level of challenges that we face in the agricultural sector, even the healthcare, the environment across Africa. So I set up this foundation to educate, to train, to empower African researchers to utilize modern tools to equip them with the skills, the knowledge that they need to be able to develop and lead their own research agenda. Because I think it's important that we recognize that African researchers are capable of solving their own problems. In fact, they understand their problems more than anybody else, and they actually know the solutions. What they lack sometimes is the resources, the willpower from the government because of poor governance, which is everywhere. However, in some countries, we're seeing more progress than in some other countries in Africa. So, because Africa is huge, it's 54 countries, and they're all independent states. And so we set up this to empower the African researchers, right? Providing that access to knowledge, access to tools, to resources where we can, academic resources. So at least they're teaching students with relevant materials or knowledge that they can transfer, that are relevant to the problems that they face. So they can, instead of relying on the global north or technologies that we build here and disseminate, which often mostly don't quite work because of the lack of context and the lack of experience surrounding those technologies. But if they have the knowledge and access to the tools, then they can be creative to address their own problems. And so this is what we do at JR Biotek Foundation, but it's not just the training. We're also encouraging African researchers to talk to one another. And what you find is I'm from Nigeria, and we're very peculiar, beautiful, amazing people. But most times we don't agree with each other. And that's because we have religious differences, there are so many conflicts or differences that we don't actually always work together, right? Tribal issues and all that stuff. And then Nigerians are there, Ghanaians are there. Sometimes the solution we need, maybe in Ghana, maybe in Kenya, maybe in Ethiopia, when we don't talk to each other, we don't know where the solutions are. What you see is that the researchers always look to the global north for solutions when they can actually talk together, use what they have to create what they don't have. And so this is what we're doing at JR Biotek Foundation, is to sort of change that mindset, cause a shift in the mindset of our people to start to talk to each other and start to develop solutions for themselves and the future generation.
So more Pan-African collaboration, not so much reliance on north-south flows. It sounds fascinating and really.
We need all. Yeah. We need all that collaboration, but we want to see themselves that they are capable and they can actually develop and lead research agenda to solve their own problems in partnerships with international collaborators and colleagues, because we do need to work globally. It's a global world, right? So we have to communicate with each other and see what's going on there. But what we don't want to do is to rely rely totally on solutions coming from the global north to the global south to solve the problems, because it really hasn't worked. And I don't think that it just that way would work.
Thank you. Giles, I know that you also do, in fact, collaborate. You work in Africa. I think you've started some recent work with the Gates Foundation. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my research focuses on replacing inorganic fertilizers with beneficial microorganisms that can essentially deliver the same nutrients that are there in fertilizers, principally phosphorus and nitrogen. And those technologies would be brilliant for in the UK and other high-income countries because they could help the sustainability of the system. But the greatest potential beneficiaries are smallholder farmers because their productivity is so poor simply because they're not using these fertilizers. So they have very little nitrogen and phosphorus that they add to their crops, and so their crops perform very poorly. So the biggest beneficiaries of the technologies we are working on are smallholder farmers, but they're also probably some of the hardest farmers to impact. Really hard to get to and hard to get technologies to. They have very little buying power. They're often in isolated regions, so extremely challenging to impact. And it's almost impossible for me sitting in Cambridge to say, okay, I'm going to solve that problem all in one. So very clearly, we definitely need to do that through partnerships. And so we're developing, particularly focused this year on developing putting in place the partnerships we need with researchers in sub-Saharan Africa to work alongside us to develop the technologies and test them also in fields in Africa. And I totally agree with Carol. It can't simply be, technologies in the north handed over to people in the south. It's got to, I think if you're going to have impact, particularly for smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, we have to work in partnership with colleagues in those nations.
David, I know that you also work outside the UK internationally. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to in Malaysia.
Okay, yeah, well in Malaysia and Indonesia have both deforested large areas of their lowlands in the last 40 years. It's an amazing transformation. And that's made money in terms of timber and then latterly planting oil palm and making money from that. And so the countries have become quite wealthy. This distribution of wealth is perhaps more questionable, but they've grown in wealth. And the question is now, what do we do going forward? There's large areas of degraded forest left. There's some really nice bits of forest. And there's also lots of oil palm estate. And some of it's maturing and needs chopping down and replanting. And so we've been working on the ground, but also with remote sensing technologies to really assess where the good quality forests are left, the degraded forests which are good quality are left, and distinguishing that from the areas which may get converted to oil palm in the future. And so working with organizations down there which are actually looking to a more sustainable future, the roundtable on sustainable oil palm, and you now might see that sustainable sign on your food products in the supermarket, working with the oil palm industry to try and make them more sustainable. And so there's some simple things we can do. So leaving substantial areas, 100, 200 meters wide of rainforest along the riverways makes an enormous difference for biodiversity. And we've really got to push for that. And not clearing rainforest on really steep slopes is a bit of a no-brainer as well, but it does happen. And so we've got the technologies, the remote sensing technologies, which allow this to be monitored. And one last thing which we're doing in Cambridge, it's not me, it's Ed Turner in zoology, but just working with the oil palm companies to not use so many insecticides and herbicides, but instead think about using natural systems to kill the pests on the crops. Integrated pest management, it's called. So making use of nature to actually control some of the pests.
Thank you. I want to shift gears a little bit because I'm sure that many participants are wondering what they can do in this context to make their own choices perhaps better from a sustainable productivity point of view. What would you suggest consumers need to do? Do we have to change our attitude? Should we be cutting down on meat, on imported vegetables? Should we be avoiding palm oil products? Giles, any suggestions?
Certainly. I mean, I think the number one is eat less meat, right? And So here in the UK, we've seen a lot of interest in veganism, and I think that's brilliant. And it would be awesome if the world population would just cut their meat consumption in half. It would make a huge difference. However, when you look globally, meat consumption is going up, and places like sub-Saharan Africa and China are really developing quickly. As people become more wealthy, they tend to eat more meat. So I think the thing to avoid is the assumption that personal consumer choice will solve the problem. I don't think we're going to solve the demand for agricultural products by simply relying on consumer choice. It has a role to play, but you also have to transform the farming system as well.
Thanks. David, anything you'd add on that question?
Well, I agree completely about eating less meat. I think ruminants, particularly, so cows and sheep, chicken and pigs, are less of a problem. And the problem of wealth, massive chunks of the world's population, India and China, as they become wealthier, consuming more meat and also more vegetable oils, is putting a lot of pressure on our tropical systems, I'm afraid. Oil palm is actually a really complicated one, I think, because oil palm is incredibly productive per unit area of land. And although we've grown to hate it, it is actually producing a large amount of yield per unit area of the tropics. And if we need that oil and we're taking it from somewhere else, we need a lot more land to produce that oil. And there's also things like coconut. We all love coconut, but we hate oil palm. But actually, it's the same thing. There are palms producing oil in different parts of the tropics. So there's this sort of strange thing going on in our psyches about what's good and bad in the tropics.
Thank you. As always, these choices are not so easy at an individual level, and an important point that they may not be enough in any event, that it's systems that have to change. Carol, we are talking about choice, but sometimes for people in parts of Africa, there isn't a lot of choice. There may simply be not enough to eat. How do we really fundamentally address that even more crucial problem?
Yeah, that's an important question, because when I hear here that people have a choice not to eat meat or not to eat certain things, I say that's a developed world problem. When you come to African countries, many people don't eat meat because they don't have access to food, right? And meat is expensive, right? But for most people, that'll be sort of almost the only source of protein that they have. Yes, there are lentils, beans, and legumes and other sources of protein, but at the same time, meat has become almost a luxury for a lot of families. Like I said, the statistic here is that over 220 million people are currently hungry in Africa. 1 in 4 are undernourished. And so that's a problem. Most times, Africa does not actually have a problem with shortage of food, so to say, because we have 60% of the vast uncultivated arable land is in Africa, right? They're uncultivated. We have food, all kinds of variety. What we don't have is actually the resources to empower the farmers to produce food in a way that is sufficient and enough to feed the population. We also don't have the willpower of our governments, as well as international influences. I call them influences just to be kind and nice here. Pushing for different types of agenda that isn't really helping to address the issue of poverty that we have. So a lot of families, even in my own extended family, don't actually have a choice of what to eat because most of them are struggling to find at least a square meal a day. I remember growing up in Nigeria, food was, mostly rationed. In other words, you weren't really eating to be full and satisfied and then decide what you don't want to eat, like my son does here. You're actually eating, so you have something in your stomach. And so it puts enormous pressure on a lot of families, parents, women, farmers who actually farm, produce 90% of our food supply, but yet don't have food themselves to eat and for their families. So there is something fundamentally wrong with that picture. And so I think what we need to do is to also protect the environment, yes, but also find other means. And new technologies are good. However, we don't want to spread it too much in a way that then it disrupts the flow of farming or farming practices, right? That then interrupts, the process of farming. For instance, I will say this, I went to Benin Republic and there is a massive World Bank project for people from France coming there to run projects going into rural communities where I can't even go to talk to farmers and talk to them about mobile apps. And these are farmers who can't even speak French because they have their local dialects. They don't have even basic literacy skills. But what we are busy doing is selling mobile apps for them to connect them in order to improve them. So there's so many things that are wrong, and it's not just one answer here, but I think that we can do better. And I hope and I look forward to seeing an Africa that has enough to feed their population.
And again, you're reaffirming from a different place the importance of systemic approaches here, and not things that are just sort of seemingly easy answers. Look, we have many questions from the audience, so I'm going to turn over to questions from the participants now, because they're really good ones. The first one is about food waste in Western countries in particular. And the question is, given how much waste there is there really a need for such enhanced production? That's the question. Maybe I'll start with you, Giles.
I think I agree, there's clearly an issue on waste, and we can tackle food waste undoubtedly. But you know, that's been a possibility for how many, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years. Well, I mean, the other argument I hear is we grow enough food, so we just ship more food to those people in Africa who don't have it. I think there is an issue with regard to what we're eating and how much waste we produce, and we can certainly, that's part of the piece. I would really like to see farmers in Africa grow enough for their own consumption and their, you know, to be able to sell and have a decent education as well. So I think I don't think the answer for farmers in Africa is just to ship food aid to them. I think that that's not the right answer. You want to empower them to grow enough food. So I think that, yes, certainly we can reduce our food waste. It is a part of the puzzle. I think, in fact, this is a whole big picture here of how do we feed a massive population with the smallest environmental input possible. Reducing food waste is clearly part of that, but increasing enough food is equally a part of that.
David, would you like to add on this question?
Well, and answering one of the questions further up, actually, one of the enormous wastes of food, rather than food waste, I think, is biofuel. And if we try and solve the climate crisis by using biofuels, that's going to have a huge impact on the natural environment, because biofuels are an extremely inefficient way of converting solar energy into human usable energy. And so we will just lose much of our remaining tropical forests and large areas to biofuel. So that's a waste of food rather than food waste. But we also have got to address the issues of food waste in the West as well.
Really interesting. We've got some very good provocative approaches here and issues. One person has asked about a debate currently happening in India about how to address food poverty best. And the interlocutor says one group is arguing that government needs to provide free food directly through public distribution systems, and other people say that the government needs to give money to individuals so that they can buy whatever food they like, and other people talk about food stamp programs. Do you have any sense, and I'm going to go to you first, Carol, as to whether you think any one of these approaches is the right approach, or is it a misconceived entirely to try to address food poverty in any of these ways?
I think that's not a sustainable solution for a long-term problem, right? That has been there and is still there. However, I do see that an approach, a mixture or a combination of it, can work for temporary easing or provision of relief for struggling families or those who can eat, right? So in America, there are food stamps. Here, there is a social benefit where the government actually pays people, provide housing benefits and access to food. So yes, we do need those. However, what we need fundamentally is for the government to create policies and policy frameworks that actually will address the root cause of hunger in Africa. And that will be, how do you empower the smallholder farmers? Land is a problem for most of Africa. Even though the 60% of uncultivated arable land is in Africa, a lot of farmers don't have land to cultivate their crops. In Ethiopia, land issue is a problem. And that has been going on for so long, where people don't have free access to land. Now, in Nigeria, my own peculiar, beautiful home country, the rich people are intimidating the poor people by taking up their lands and building hotels and luxury homes. And this is just a small percentage of the population. So the issue of land has to be addressed from the government standpoint. Tools Mechanized farming is important. Most of the women, young people are no longer interested in agriculture and subsistence farming because it takes so long, it's laborious, and it does not bring any income to help them or their families. So what you see is that there's a lot of people moving out from the rural communities to urban communities where most times they're even homeless. They're hawking on the streets to make ends meet because farming is no more lucrative, right? So how do we empower the young people? Investing in agribusiness is an option. Investing in research and development, agricultural research and development, where education, training, and capacity building is at the forefront in our universities, transforming the agricultural system, the education system as well. So then it's up to speed to modern technologies and how people can actually apply it to create the solution. So, I mean, we can go on and on, right? I do have quite a lot of ideas of how our governments, if they'll listen to me, but, you know, but yeah, it's a multifaceted problem. And, you know, we can address it as we can, as from the international standpoint, we can address some of this problem, providing education like we're doing, providing some kind of resources to at least empower the researchers who then work with the extension farmers, who work with the smallholder farmers, to at least provide basic education, training on how to, you know, intercrop, or how to improve what they have in the meantime, while we wait for some of our governments to wake up to the reality.
Okay, so short term, yes, maybe some band-aid solutions, but there's medium-term action that we should be taking now, and big policy questions that have to be addressed by government. Different type of question. No, go ahead. Go ahead, Giles.
But so, you know, we often solve, so places in Africa have, you know, a drought, and suddenly there's a famine, and we address it with a food plaster of food aid, and we dump a load of free food into that country, which addresses the immediate starvation issue. But food aid is actually a disaster when you talk about the agricultural economy. And most of the people in that landscape are farmers who are actually dependent on their products to make money. And if you dump free food into the market, you undermine the value of their products. So, you know, food aid is a plaster that you can stick over an immediate crisis, but it's absolutely not the long-term solution. And exactly what Carol said, how do you empower smallholder farmers? 70% of the world's population who live under $1 a day are smallholder farmers. So the best way to get them out of that poverty is to raise the productivity of their farm, because that's their income. So I think the long-term solution here is to raise their productivity, because it gives them the means to develop themselves and to educate their children, etc. That's their product. So empowering smallholder farmers to produce more is far better than this plaster that we stick over the occasional crisis, or these crises and the famines that emerge. I don't think that's a solution at all.
Thank you. David, different type of question, a bit more technical in a sense. This is about opportunities for soil enrichment, including the recapture of carbon in soil. Is this something that we should be focused on as a means of addressing the challenges that we're discussing here in terms of food productivity?
Certainly is. Yes, it's a good point. Of course, our arable systems, where we're just growing cereals year after year on the same land, causes the carbon from the soil to all but disappear. And if you look at a grassland, it's got much more carbon in it. And so efforts to get more carbon back into the soil, regenerative agricultural techniques, are going to be a part of the story for sure in the UK and beyond. And so I think it's a very active area, how you can actually put carbon into the soil through returning decomposed plants or not disturbing the soil. How can you make sure that carbon doesn't just disappear over 2 or 3 years through microbial decomposition? So what's the best way of doing that? But it's definitely going to be part of the story. And
I think that highlights actually a benefit of GM, because actually herbicide tolerant crops, you don't need to plow the land, because you control the principal reason to plow the land is to control weeds before you plant your crop. But with herbicide tolerant crops, you control the weeds in a different way, and you can reduce. So you are seeing quite a big no-till movement emerging in the US, where they're not plowing, and that is great is much better for soil fertility, because you allow more carbon accumulation if you're not plowing.
Carol, question for you specifically about impact of climate change that you're already seeing in African agriculture, and particularly related to both food safety issues and then also migration, which you referred to in terms of urbanization as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Right, so climate change effect is a major one. And I don't think that we are talking about it enough. I don't think it's making any kind of sense really to a lot of people, except for those who are educated in that way to sort of be aware of its impact. We don't have enough awareness campaign programs to kind of create that awareness that we need to know. The population in Africa, not really at the small scale farmer level, because they really don't care about what the climate is doing. All they want to do is have their crops grow and have that access. But from the point of the government, again, it goes back to the government, it goes back to creating policies that will actually put some things on the check and create that opportunity, so then we are utilizing less land, so to say, but being more efficient in our agricultural practices, right? So I think that's a major issue that needs to be addressed. But right now, I don't think that has not really come as critical or very important. And that's because a lot of the farmers are still struggling anyway to have access to seeds. So GM seeds are great, GM technology is great. However, the major problem across Africa is that they can't afford the seeds. They can't afford to buy those seeds. In fact, the seed system is a major challenge now, because now there's a lot of mix up of all kinds of varieties of seeds. For instance, if I'm a rice grower, I have the local varieties from somewhere, I have all GM seeds. And the farmers are complaining that what happened to the seed bag that you gave me yesterday is now mixed up. I'm now having lower production. So there is a mixture of seeds, including GM with local varieties, with natural, so all kinds of things going on at that level that need to be checked, right? We need to have proper regulations, more strict regulations on how this technology are disseminated into Africa. Where are they coming from? Who's disseminating it? In fact, with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus, it might be surprising, but actually the spores now are being sold in markets across Ghana, in Nigeria, to farmers. And what you see is that the scientists that we have worked with through our foundation are also looking to identify the highest performing spores or highest performing seed varieties, so they can, give it to farmers to have access. But that's at an individual level, so to say. The government is not coming into these issues to actually take the forefront to address them. And so it's a big problem. Our soils are deteriorating rapidly. And environmental pollution is a major problem. In fact, food waste is there as well. But the post-harvest waste is even more than, here we're talking about, the grocery stores shut down and then they throw everything in the bin, can't even give it to people to eat, right? Sometimes I want to go to Co-op and get the cheaper ones that are marked down. But at home, it's actually the post-harvest. So when they harvest tomatoes from the farms, because they don't have good access to the market, because of transportation issues and all that, then the food goes bad and they have to go to waste. And that's a smallholder farmer losing an entire season of cropping and energy. So yes, climate change is a major issue, but we're not talking about it enough. And I think because there are these other pressing, so to say, issues that have taken over the conversation.
Thanks. Giles, do you want to comment at all on the GM seed issue that Carol talked about? You referred to it a little bit yourself earlier.
Yeah, so I'd be surprised if, that's really the only GM crop that's being grown in Africa commercially is GM cotton. So I'd be very surprised if there's GM seeds sort of getting mixed up in other seed bulks. But there is definitely an issue of seed certification that, you can buy packs of seed on a market in Africa that claim to be one thing and are not. So yeah, I mean, Carol's highlighting there's a lot of problems in the system, particularly when we're dealing with Africa. I think we have to be careful not to just sort of throw our hands up and say, oh, there's so many problems, we can't do anything. So, the seed system is a solvable problem. We've solved that problem here in the UK. Validation of lines is a solvable problem. We've solved that problem here. So, there's a means that where there's a will, there's a way. And I think, as Carol has said, I think if African governments really got on board and really aligned to what needs to be put in place, and that aligned with the sort of the organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Foreign Commonwealth Office, for instance, I think there'll be a real possibility to make truly transformational change there. But as Carol says, there's a lot that needs to be put in place to achieve that.
Thanks. David, you referred earlier to your distrust of solutions based around biofuels. And there's a related question here from someone in the audience about just basic competition amongst land uses, even for things that seem very positive. So the argument here is, greenfield sites being taken up for mega scale solar projects, for example. Is there a risk, especially in a country with limited land base like the UK, that we're going to get into a position where we've got really competing positive uses that will actually undermine the food systems further?
Very good question. Yeah, yes. I mean, one of the bits of work I've been thinking about recently is where to plant 30,000 hectares of trees per year, which is what the government's promised to do in our crowded Isle. And we don't want to plant them on prime agricultural land because that will just take us out of food production, and we've got to import that food and perhaps cause more damage somewhere else to the environment. Where do you plant them? Well, the easiest place is to plant them up in the uplands where the soils are poor and there's little biodiversity, and there's enough land there to plant trees to take up carbon is the government's main purpose for doing that. But that would only work if we eat less meat. Otherwise, again, we're displacing the problem of buying in meat from overseas rather than growing it on our own shore. So I think anything we do in Europe or these highly populated areas, there's fundamental trade-offs which we've got to worry about. But I think there's often solutions with some careful thought. I mean, there's plenty of roof space to put solar panels on, for example, in urban areas. So do we need to put them on greenfield sites?
Thank you. There are lots of questions, and we're starting to run out of time, I'm afraid. But Giles, there's a pretty fundamental question about whether big agricultural corporations are actually open to the sustainable approaches that you've discussed. Are you seeing any changing patterns there?
Most definitely. Actually, I think most of the big ag companies recognize sustainability as the future. I mean, it's also, sustainability is, in theory, more profitable. If you can have the same productivity with fewer inputs, you don't have to buy the chemical fertilizer, you don't have to use your tractors to spray them on the land. It's actually easier to grow crops without having all those inputs, and certainly cheaper. So certainly the large corporations are interested, but there's also a lot of interest from the philanthropic organizations as well. And I'm actually really excited about that. So all of my work funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And in fact, all the technologies that we develop are going to be owned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So the technology is not going to be owned by large corporations. It's going to be owned by a charitable foundation who cares about ensuring that the poorest people on the planet can grow enough food. So, and I think that that's a new model of approaching, particularly things like genetic modification, rather than leaving it in the control of a few corporations, actually having it in the control of a foundation who has a specific charitable interest, and rather than a profitable one.
Thanks. We're really close to the end here, but there's an interesting question about whether or not there will be what you might describe as orphan crops in Africa and I suppose other parts of the world because they're not profitable for large corporations. Carol, do you want to start? And then I'll ask you, Giles, for your comments on that, and David, if you have any final comments, but I'm going to have to ask you to be very quick.
Yeah, absolutely. There are hundreds of neglected or orphan crops in Africa, and most of them are indigenous. So these are the crops that people prefer to eat more than rice, more than maize, and the things that, the economic sort of crops or the crops that, most of the international funders would like to support, which we need to now invest in. But actually, the good thing or the good news is that a lot of African researchers are now turning around to look at how to improve the orphan crops and how to, build them to a point where they understand a lot more about their, the genome, what they consist of, the nutritional values of those crops, and how they can actually enhance them so that, most of the African people can have access to this food, which I love. Most of them actually end up becoming very extinct due to climate change effects. And just quickly, just to let Giles know that, it's not just BT cotton that is the GM. There is BT maize. There's also rice, all kinds of improved varieties of rice sent from Faro, a lot of international organizations that are modifying and sending seeds to Africa. And then it's getting to the smallholder farmers and they're all mixing it up. And so we need the checks and balances there. But yes, I'm yes for orphan crops, and I hope that we can invest more.
Giles, thank you, Carol. Giles, any comments on orphan crops?
So an orphan crop is an orphan because it's not been genetically improved. So it means that there's not it's not had the sort of genetics work done to it, which means that you can really improve it even particularly effectively through breeding. So at the Crop Science Centre here in Cambridge, I'm really excited about, we're working on a new initiative, Adopt a Crop, because it doesn't take much actually to convert an orphan crop to a non-orphan crop, to make it, essentially take it forward so it is a fully genetically tractable system. And in fact, now with genomics as they are, we can sequence the genome of these crops. That's already going on. We can control make the genetics as simple as possible so you can take it forwards for breeding, and we can sequence all the diversity that's present. So I think we can actually quite quickly convert an orphan crop into a crop that can be easily genetically improved. And it's something that we're excited to be trying to put in place right now here at the Crop Science Centre.
Thanks. We really are out of time, but I want to give David the last word and ask you, David, whether despite all the complexity which we have heard about and all of the systemic change that's required, are you optimistic that we really can make a big difference to human food security over the course of the next generation?
I'm semi-optimistic. I think what we'll see over the next few decades is a continuation of loss of tropical nature, no question about that. But I am hopeful that we'll carry on producing enough food for everybody. And I think as this growing recognition of the climate crisis, but also the biodiversity crisis sets in people's minds, that there will be an appetite to properly protect large areas of remaining nature. That's my hope, that the whole world will be more black and white in terms of protected areas and intensive agriculture. That's the way I think it's going, and I guess you could take that as possibly optimistic or pessimistic.
Great. Well, look, we've run out of time, unfortunately. I thank you all for really interesting questions. We could have gone on for another hour, but I want to thank our truly excellent speakers, Giles, David, and Carol. It was a really informative and fascinating conversation. Going forward, on Tuesday, the 15th of June, please join me and Professor Hans van de Ven and Dr. Shruti Kapila for an illuminating discussion ranging from World War II and decolonization to the present day beyond. The shaping of Asia will shape our future. So keep an eye out for your invitations. In the meantime, this conversation will shortly be posted on our YouTube channel. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Stay safe.